brought together in the Department of the Interior of the National Park Service, where today we live alongside over 400 other national parks, some of which I'm assured are better known than Guilford Courthouse, places like Yosemite or Grand Canyon. They probably say the same thing out there. But the idea of preserving this field goes back to the vision of Judge David Shank, who came to Greensboro in the early 1880s as a corporate lawyer for a railway that ran right through these grounds. Judge Shank loved history, and he was distressed that so few people in Greensboro, which was then a town about 5 miles behind you, could tell you anything about the battle. So he organized the Guilford Battleground Company to help raise some money, and he bought up as much land as he could afford, created a private park of about 50 acres with the long-term goal of seeing the significance recognized by making it a national park. Guilford Battleground Company, reconstituted in recent years, remains an important support agency for today's national park. But our interest, of course, is in the battle. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought on the afternoon of March 15, 1781. It was one of the longest, bloodiest, most significant engagements of the American Revolutionary War, and it did not even involve George Washington, who remained encamped outside of New York City, keeping an eye on the British coast there. Instead, this battle was part of the Southern Campaign of 1780-81, a last-ditch British effort to reclaim control of His Majesty's southern colonies. The campaign had started out well for the British with the capture of Charleston and the surrender of an entire American army in May 1780, and the appointment of Lord Charles II Earl Cornwallis to command British forces. Cornwallis took the offensive. He moved into the back country. He defeated a second American army at Camden in August, and at that point, a desperate Congress turned to General Washington and asked him to appoint a new commander for the Southern Department. Without hesitation, Washington chose Major General Nathaniel Greene to come south. When Greene arrived in Charlotte in December, he was stunned to find the condition of the forces at his command, also what partisan warfare had done to the countryside. So he immediately put off any engagement with Cornwallis, staging a masterful strategic retreat across the state, crossing one rain-swollen river after another just ahead of the British. Wings of the two armies encountered each other at Cowpens in January, which resulted in a stunning American victory and the capture of over 400 British soldiers taken as prisoners. That enraged Cornwallis to the point that he began to burn some of his own baggage to lighten the movement of his army. Greene stayed ahead of him. He brought his force. So this road locally was called New Garden, but it was part of a major highway that ran through the back country. To the east, it went to Hillsboro, the largest settlement in the back country, southwest down to Salisbury. But the road was called New Garden locally because of a settlement of Quakers 4 miles to our west, the New Garden community. Guilford College is in that area today. Guilford, a Quaker established school. The road ran from there to the courthouse 3/4 of a mile to our east. And if we were standing on New Garden Road the day of the battle, we'd have been in the way of about 1,000 North Carolina militiamen scrambling to take up a position about halfway down this long sloping hill. The troops here closest to the road on either side of it were standing behind a split rail fence that bordered the property of Joseph Hoskins. Hoskins' homestead is still preserved. It's the last driveway on the left before you get to the stoplight intersection. But the line, at nearly a mile in length, stretched north and south of the road on into dense woods. Greene knew that those militia had little training and less experience. He didn't expect they would stand long in the face of a concerted British bayonet attack. but he hoped they would slow the British down. Greene placed regular troops on the flanks of the line, William Washington and the American cavalry on this flank, along with some Delaware Continentals led by Robert Kirkwood, Virginia Continentals on the left flank, along with Virginia and North Carolina riflemen and Lee's Legion mounted infantry. Those detachments angled to the line so that they could fire across it as the British came within range. And in the early afternoon, that's exactly what happened. The troops here closest to Mr. Hoskins' property could look down the hill across those open fields and see the British column marching in this direction. Greene welcomed Cornwallis to the field by bringing 2 cannon into the road, 6-pounder guns, sending solid shot down the hill, just harassing the British as they deployed. Cornwallis responded in kind. He brought up 3-pounder guns, saw a reproduction in the lobby of the visitor center, sending solid shot mostly over the heads of the militia as the British prepared for battle. Cornwallis sent 2 regiments to our right and 2 to our left. North of the road to the right, he deployed the 20th. Before suddenly unexpectedly dying, leaving his wife to sort out his complicated business affairs. With the help of friends like President George Washington and Secretary of State Alexander Hamilton, she was able to get Congress to pass the appropriate legislation. So, quite a remarkable figure. The allegorical figure to the front is dressed in classical robes. She has on her left arm a shield with an eagle surrounded by 13 stars, so that seems straightforward symbolism. In her right hand, though, she holds a palm frond. In antiquity, the palm was understood as a symbol of victory, and that makes sense, victory the American cause, but also sometimes as a gesture of reconciliation. In 1915, when the monument was dedicated, Britain was engaged in the First World War. Some thinking that would eventually bring in the United States on the side of the British, which it did. Here's a gesture to a former foe, a present-day ally. North Carolina had 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence, so I have to call your attention to the Signers Monument, an example of the kind of monument that was dedicated back in the 1890s that perhaps we would consider appropriate for the battlefield today. North Carolina signers were William Hooper, John Penn, and Joseph Hughes. 2 of them, Mr. Hooper, remained in front of the cart. Or did it take a winding route? We concluded it probably went straight down the hill. It's not too steep. But we found a row of sugar maples. You can just barely make out 1, 2, 3. There are a couple more down the road. Sugar maples are not native to North Carolina. They were planted in the days of the Battleground Company to line the early tour roads they set out. So, a long forgotten and rediscovered tour road. But I want to stay here to come to this 18th century intersection. Here at New Garden, this path went north to a settlement called Bruce's Crossroads, today's Summerfield community. So this was known at the time of the battle. Standing here, we can look a little bit to the east and imagine a scene, well, it's hard with all the trees today to imagine. So I brought 2 illustrations, and I'll pass these around. The first is by an artist and author named Benson Lawsey. Vincent Lawson was writing a history of the American Revolution, and he tried to visit as many of the sites as he was writing about that he could. So he spent a day here at Guilford. You see, it must have been a snowy day. And he stood just about where you're standing to draw this view. So here is the road sign that must have been somewhere at this intersection. This abandoned farmhouse would have been where the bench is. You see New Garden Road coming down this hill and continuing in a series of declines across the middle background here, and open ground. And if you look carefully, off in the distance you see the village that surrounded the courthouse. By 1850, the courts had moved to the newly established town of Greensboro, named after Nathaniel Greene. But the village hung on for a little while longer, a few scattered farm residences. So you see that off in the distance. If it were still standing and the trees were not, we could see the courthouse from here. We're not going to go quite that far, but we will get a little closer. About 50 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, a young artist spent some time here, and she painted a view from about where you are. The Maryland and the Delaware monuments are right behind you, and she's looking across a similar scene. Here is what we think was New Garden Road. These young saplings, perhaps those sugar maples off to the right. You notice that even if you can see through the trees, whatever remained of the village had disappeared by 1900, even earlier, and the trees had taken over what had been open ground. It's the open ground that interests us because around this area the trees thinned out and the ground opened up. It went down into what's today wet ground, so perhaps it was open and not being cultivated, and then began to rise in the distance to the courthouse village. So let's get back on the gravel and walk down this hill. And if you look at those bollards and the way they're positioned, again, the ones on the hill, that's roughly where the 2nd Maryland was lined up. Part of the regiment facing south, in case the British came up from that direction. Greene put 2 of his cannon in the road, and then the regiment bent and began to follow that high ground just below the courthouse plateau. 2nd Maryland knew. To their right, continuing the line on the high ground, was the 1st Maryland with Delaware Continentals attached to them. And then furthering the line even outside the present park boundaries, the 2 regiments of newly raised Virginia troops. By this point, the British had lost a lot of forward momentum. The Von Botha Regiment is engaged in the south. The Highlanders are struggling to punch through the 2nd line. It's Colonel James Webster with the 33rd to the north, whose men break out of the woods first. And without waiting for backup, those soldiers charge down into the vale, attacking the rising ground and receiving a full volley fire from the 1st Maryland and some of the Virginia Continentals, sending the 33rd reeling back up the high ground. We don't know if Webster could not see clearly because of the tree line where those Continentals were positioned, or whether his men had their blood up and the officers thought a good bayonet attack will rout the rebel army. Webster had his men lie down because Greene, with his 2 other cannon, had begun to fire grape shot across the vale. While that's winding down, and perhaps even unaware of it, Lieutenant Colonel James Stewart comes along the road leading an attack by the 2nd Guards. Remember, it's the 2nd Guards held in reserve at the beginning of the battle. It's a casualty where Sergeant Lamb finds extra ammunition. Now Stewart is leading his men, and they spy the 2 cannon that Greene's placed in the road. His troops charge those guns. The inexperienced 2nd Maryland lets loose a ragged volley, and then those Continentals begin to break from their position and stream back toward the courthouse. When Greene hears of this, and we think he's to the north, he's afraid that his 3rd line has now been breached. Greene had put everything he had on the field. He's held nothing in reserves. And as aggressive as he could be, Greene also had the realization that his army was the 3rd to operate in the South in the last year and a half. If he lost it, like the previous ones had been lost, that may have been the end of American hopes. So instead, he knew that if he wanted, he had a road that ran north from the courthouse to Troublesome Creek, about a dozen miles from here, where he had already established a camp. He had a way off the field. His army was in good order, at least the Continentals were. Who knows where the militia ended up. And so we think at that point Greene decided to call it a day and to begin to withdraw men from the field. While he's doing so, the battle assumed its own momentum. And so let's just take a side step down into the vale to get a sense of that. Rising in the distance, we could see the position if it weren't for the leaves on the tree. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart leads his men into the attack. The 2nd Maryland breaks from their position. As the guards push closer to the courthouse, they got themselves into the rear of the 1st Maryland without knowing it, maybe the tree line. The officers of the 1st, however, knew exactly what was happening, ordered the men to turn in position and to fire into the flank and the rear of the guards, and then to charge them with the bayonet. So for the first time that day, the British were on the receiving end of a bayonet attack. It sent the guards careening back into the open ground, where for the next few minutes, what must have seemed like an eternity, there was fierce, close order fighting. In 1903, F.C. Yawn, a well-known illustrator, did a series of paintings for a history of the war written by Henry Cabot Lodge, and this is his view of the fighting at the 3rd line. And while there's plenty of historical detail that's not correct, Yawn had a sense of the action. It's in that close order fighting that Colonel Stewart of the Guards meets his end. He sees an American officer, Captain John Smith of the 1st Maryland, about to dispatch a British soldier. Colonel Stewart lunges at Captain Smith with his small sword, but as he did, he slipped on the body of a fallen soldier, allowing Captain Smith just enough time to pivot, raise his arm to see Stewart's blade pass under it, to feel the hilt strike his shoulder, and then to recover with a blow from his sword that killed Stewart on the spot. Dramatic, close order fighting, and to even heighten it, imagine Colonel William Washington bringing the American cavalry around the courthouse into the road, also attacking the guards. Those horsemen riding through the ranks of the British, swinging their sabers, wheeling around and riding through them again. It's in that scene that Cornwallis arrives, perhaps on this high ground, brings up a couple of his cannon, has them loaded with canister and fired to drive off the horse soldiers. Two sides disengage. If Greene had not decided to withdraw, he certainly did by this point, pulling men from the field, relieved that his army is in good order, marching them north. About a mile from here, Greene pauses to let his men catch their breath. Perhaps he hears one last volley fire from Virginia Continentals who check the Highlanders who have begun to make an appearance at the courthouse. But to Greene's great relief, he finds that the British have remained on the field. They're not pursuing him. One American officer looked at his watch and calculated it had been 2.5 hours since the opening shots of the battle. It's now late afternoon on an overcast day. It began to rain that night. It rained solid for the next 2 days. He retained the fields, and that meant that Cornwallis could claim the victory. It was a pretty tough night. One of his senior officers said he heard sounds of agony on the field unlike any in Carolina, but finding at the end of each engagement the British withdrawing their outposts, so that by September the American army was encamped in the outskirts of Charleston. In Greene's words, "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again." From Wilmington, Cornwallis decided to carry the war into Virginia. He united with a small command led by Benedict Arnold. He sparred with a Continental force led by Lafayette, And then Cornwallis received orders to settle into the port at Yorktown along the York River, about 50 miles up from the Chesapeake Bay, where the British Navy could sail, rescue him, and return him to New York City. We know how that turned out, right? French fleet came up, blocked entrance to the Chesapeake, while Washington marched the French and American army down from New York, surrounding Cornwallis and forcing his surrender 7 months after this battle. Word of the fight here got back to Parliament in June '81, and even with Cornwallis's glowing report and the credit he gave to the discipline of his soldiers, critics could read between the lines. One member of Parliament said Cornwallis had conquered himself out of shoes and provisions. Another said he had won a victory with all the appearance of defeat. So even early on, the significance of the engagement was being recognized. The presence of those two armies set off fierce partisan fighting for the next few weeks that eventually died down. The courthouse returned to its quiet ways until 1791, 10 years later, when it entertained a distinguished visitor. We'll rejoin New Garden Road, head back to the visitor center, and I'll tell you about that visit. Tour of the southern states. His first term, he wanted to visit all the states to simply show the people what an American president looked like. So we came through here, heading to Mount Vernon for a little rest. We spent part of the day here on the field with the governor and some veterans of the battle. I was not on duty that day, but we know a lot of what Washington was thinking because when he returned to the Capitol, he shared his thoughts with the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who recorded them in his diary. So we know what Washington thought about Greene's tactics, but of course, 1791, Greene is long in his grave, and so the two men could no longer correspond. Had he lived, one of Washington's recent biographers thinks that Greene might have served the administration as the Secretary of War. Ed Griffin, that enslaved man from the eastern part of the state who fought with the North Carolina militia, he survived. He served in the Army until '82. He returned home to Edgecombe County, and guess who forgot the promise? However, it was widely known in the neighborhood, and several folk brought a lawsuit. The General Assembly ordered Ned Griffin to be freed in 1784. Not so with the three men lying at rest here. This is the Delaware, or the Continental Monument, and it's actually a grave site. The marble itself is composed of three different colors of stone, right? The white, the blue, and that's pink marble, but we'll call it red so that we have a color scheme going. Three Delaware troops, and their story is like this: walking across a farmer's fields up to the north after a rainstorm, Judge Shank saw that the water had exposed human remains. Looking more closely, he found the graves of three individuals and collected about a half a dozen pewter USA monogrammed buttons. This is a reproduction of what one of those buttons looked like.
So any significance of the colors, or it's
red,
just
white, and blue, the American flag.
Okay, American flag. Yeah.
In French.
Yeah.
So
French.
based on, yeah, well, no, it's blue, white, and red in French.
Oh,
right?
okay. Mm-hmm.
So based on the buttons and the position of the graves, the right flank of the first American line, Shank concluded those were troops under the command of Robert Kirkwood, that detachment of Delaware men anchoring the militia line. He had the remains reinterred here and the monument erected over them in 1889. We know what he did not, and that is the three killed in that outfit. The three resting here are William Drew, John Toland, and Cornelius Agnew, an Irish immigrant. That makes this an unusual location. Here on a Revolutionary battlefield are the graves of three enlisted men killed in the battle and identified by name. It doesn't happen in many places.
How'd they identify them?
The muster returns from the regiment. We have those.
Oh.
And if you haven't gotten enough trivia for one afternoon, I would tell you that March 15th, 1781 was a Thursday, which was considered significant enough to engrave in marble.
Mm-hmm.
Big Thursday.
So we're back here on New Garden Road, the Green Monument coming up on our left, and then we'll cross back to the visitor center.
you like to begin the